Okay, hello everyone. Today I'll be sharing my research and pilot study. My study explores tourist awareness, perception, and engagement with hotel water conservation practices in Boracay Island, Philippines. I will be sharing my experience and what I've learned throughout the process. Starting off, my purpose for this study is my interest began because Philippines is my home country and Boracay is one of the Philippines' most popular tourist destination. And while tourism brings many economic benefits, it also places significant pressure on natural resources, particularly water resource. Many hotels have started introducing water conservation initiatives, but I became curious about the guest perspective. Do tourists actually notice these initiatives? Do they understand why they are implemented and why are they willing to participate? And these questions became the foundation of my whole study. So, the purpose of this pilot was not only to explore these questions, but also to determine whether semi structured interview were an effective method for collecting meaningful qualitative data. So, preparation and planning before conducting the interviews, I first revisited my research proposal and refined my interview guide. Initially, my question focused directly on water conservation practices. But after the consultation and Rebecca's feedback, I realized it was important to begin with broader questions about the participants' travel experiences, the background, or what motivates them to travel. So I reorganized the interview guide questions. And after finalizing the question, I recruited three participants who had recently visited Boracay and conducted the pilot interviews. I have sent the consent form and applicant information sheet through email and as well as Facebook Messenger. It only took a day to get back the signed form. So I've moved on to the interview. So during the interview, I first started by asking about their trip to Boracay, the purpose of their visit, how many times they had visited the island, and the type of accommodation they chose. These questions help participants relax and recall their experiences before discussing sustainability efforts. So, before developing my initial interview question, I've reviewed my literature, which I've structured into two themes. One being the awareness and understanding, and two is for the perception and engagement. So, the first one, Ong and colleagues emphasize that Boracay's rapid tourism growth has created environmental challenges and highlighted the need for sustainable destination management. Second by Sabandal and colleagues, Sabandal and Gumban discuss how Boracay's rehabilitation encouraged greater collaboration among stakeholders to promote environmental sustainability. And the last one by Maxkill and colleagues shifted the focus to hotels and demonstrated that sustainability efforts depend not only on the hotel management but also on guest participation. So, going into the second theme, all these literature by Han, Gabarda, Malorki, and colleagues, and Park and colleagues, they all explain how tourists' environmental attitudes, travel motivation, and perception influence their willingness to support sustainability initiatives. While these studies provided valuable insights, I noticed that very little research specifically explored how tourists in Boracay became aware of hotel water conservation initiatives and how those experiences shaped their willingness to participate. And that became the research gap my study hopes to address. To guide my pilot study, I developed three main research questions. The first explored how tourists became aware of hotel water conservation practices. The second focused on how do tourists perceive the relationship between hotel water conservation practices and their overall guest experiences. Lastly, I wanted to understand what motivates or discourages tourists from participating in hotel water conservation initiative. And together, these questions allowed me to explore awareness, perception, and engagement from the guest perspective. So, to answer those research questions I just mentioned, I use semi structured interviews. I chose this method because it allowed participants to share their personal experiences freely while still keeping the conversation focused on my research objectives. So the interview guide began with travel context question, or more on the background of their travel, like the purpose of their travel, number of visits, type of accommodation, and the length of their stay. Followed by question about awareness of water conservation initiative, like what practices they have noticed, and how were they communicated to them. Third is perceptions of those initiatives, like how did it affect their experience. And finally, their willingness to participate and suggestion for improvement, like what encourage or discourage them and how could hotels improve. Moving on to the field notes, one of the most valuable parts of this pilot study was keeping notes besides the recording immediately after each interview. Like I mentioned, I've interviewed three participants. My first participant stayed in a hotel and did not notice any visible water conservation initiatives. However, they have shared that they voluntarily reused towels and linens because they personally valued environmental conservation. The second participant stayed in an Airbnb. It's not a hotel, but yeah, similar to the first participants, they did not observe any sustainability initiative, but still practice water conservation based on their own environmental awareness, like simple things such as turning off the sink when not in use. And also, the interview ended with her suggestions for educational activities to remind everyone or give knowledge about sustainability. My third participant had a very different experience, having visited Boracay four times. She also stayed in a luxury hotel. They noticed several water conservation initiatives, including refill stations, informational signage, housekeeping policies, and sustainability booklets. They also explained that these initiative increased their appreciation of the hotel because they reflected a commitment to protecting Boracay's environment. But comparing these different experiences, it made me realize that awareness can vary considerably depending on the type of accommodation and how sustainability practices are communicated. So, since this was only a pilot study with three participants, my goal wasn't to complete a full coding process like the one that we have practiced last week. So I reviewed the responses and looked for recurring ideas and patterns. For example, two participants talk about not noticing any water conservation practices, which suggested a pattern of flow awareness. Another participant described refill station, informational signage, and housekeeping policies, which reflected visible sustainability initiatives. If I were to conduct a full study, I would systematically code these responses and organize them into broader themes that align with my research question. But these pilot studies showed me that thematic analysis would be an appropriate method for analyzing the data. Moving on to my key insights, although my pilot study included only three participants, one of the biggest things I learned from this pilot was that Simply having water conservation initiative in place doesn't necessarily mean guests will notice them. It made me realize that communication is just as important as the initiatives themselves. I also learned that the people generally have a positive attitude towards sustainability, even if they didn't notice specific water saving practices during their stay. They will appreciate the idea of hotels being environmentally responsible. Then, lastly, I realized that guests are more likely to participate when water conservation practices are clearly explained and easy to follow. Small actions like visible signage, simple reminders can make a big difference in encouraging participations. These insights help me see that my research isn't just about what hotels are doing to conserve water, but also about how those efforts are communicated and experienced by guests. Lastly, to end my presentation, my reflection as a researcher, I realized that participants interpreted sustainability differently depending on the type of accommodation they stayed in and their previous experiences. I also found that starting the interview with travel related question made the conversation feel much more natural. It helped participants remember their experiences before moving into the more specific question about water conservation. Another important lesson was that some of my interview questions depended on participants noticing water conservation initiatives. But moving forward, I would revise my interview guide questions by adding alternative prompts and follow up questions so participants can still provide meaningful responses even if they didn't notice any specific initiatives. Throughout the interviews, I learned the importance of remaining neutral, listening carefully, and letting participants guide the conversation rather than leading them toward a particular answer. Finally, this pilot study expanded the way I think about my research. I started this study wanting to understand tourist perspective, but now if I were to continue this study, I see the value of working directly with hotels and Boracay as well, by understanding both what hotels are doing and how guests experience those efforts. And I believe this research could provide more practical recommendation for improving communication and encouraging greater participation in water conservation initiatives. Thank you for listening. That's it for my presentation.